Chapter 2 Altdorf. The meeting of the Grand Council broke apart some hours later, disgruntled noblemen slipping back to their private manors scattered about Altdorf's palace district, others retreating to their chambers within the imperial palace itself. There was no arguing with one of the emperor's diktats, and nothing but anger and frustration to be gained by trying. Some of the dignitaries, however, felt enough resentment to accept the invitation of Prince Sigdan Holswig, the titular ruler of Altdorf. Much of Sigdan's power was subordinate to that of Emperor Boris, leaving him with few duties and even fewer responsibilities. Since assuming the title from his late father, Sigdan's chief concern had become soothing the tempers of those who had felt the sting of the emperor's decrees. Situated overlooking the river, Sigdan's castle was a relic of older times. It was said to have been built by Sigismund II as a bulwark to command the approach of the Reich. In the distant days, Norscan reavers had been bold enough to sail their longships down the river as far as Nuln and even Freiburg. It had been the river castles built by Sigismund II which had finally ended the depredations of the longships. Gazing down from the lead-lined window overlooking the river, Detlef von Schlomberg could almost see the longships coming again. Snaga Half-Nose sailing down the Reich with a fleet of berserkers to plunder and pillage the heart of the empire. Only a few years ago, the nobleman would have found such a thing impossible. Now, he wasn't quite so certain. He had just had a very forceful reminder that the greed of his emperor knew no limits. Of course, they will discharge their warriors. Baron Fornig's voice drew von Schlomberg away from the window. A dozen or so noblemen and their retainers were gathered at Prince Sigdan's table, picking at the remains of roast boar and plates of pickled eel. What other choice do they have? You make it sound as if you don't intend to discharge your own soldiers, observed Palatine Kretzelescu. The Sylvanian dignitary looked even more drained and exasperated than he had in the imperial palace. A wolfish grin spread beneath Baron Fornig's beard. I can speak for Graf Gunfar. He won't pay this criminal tax. Don't think Boris will let him get away with that, said Aldo Broadfellow. The halfling was sitting on a large cushion, massaging his hairy feet. He glowered at his toes. Why that man insists on wearing boots when I see him, he grumbled to himself. The half-man speaks right of it, cautioned Count von Suckelhoff. Try to keep a shilling from Boris's purse, and he'll lay siege to Ulrichsburg. With what? Baron Fornig growled. He made it impossible to retain any army big enough to do the job. I don't think he hasn't thought of that, von Schlomberg said, as he returned to the table. Boris has already granted a dispensation to Westerland and Drakvold, in recognition of their ongoing travails. Van Suckelhoff drained his goblet of wine in a swallow. I half expected him to make us pay for each barbarian, he snapped. Kresselescu caught the old knight's meaning, his face growing even more pale. You mean Drakvold? He's a Hohenbach, von Schlomberg said. He could be expected to demand a certain loyalty from his homeland. He hasn't shown any particular inclination to help the Drakvolders, Prince Sigdan said. He even sent the Reichsmarshal home before the beastmen were entirely exterminated. That doesn't sound like a man with any great devotion to his birthplace. Or it shows a man too shrewd to let emotions stand in his way, suggested von Schlomberg. While Drakvold is without account, the province remains a protectorate of the imperial crown. All of its wealth belongs to the imperial treasury. The knight turned and nodded at Count van Suckelhoff. If Snaga Half-Nose had been a bit more successful, there might be two provinces in the same situation. Van Suckelhoff slammed his fist on the table. Of all the outrages, renting rooms in the imperial palace to commoners, allowing the gentry to buy new titles for themselves, these are villainies enough. But if you say it's true, then our emperor is nothing more than a black-hearted traitor. Have a care, Prince Sigdan exclaimed, anxious at the turn the conversation had taken. Why else would he refuse to bestow the title upon Duke Conrad? Baron von Clausewitz asked. Why else would he tell Bockenford to disband the army before its job was done? The Reichsmarshal's orders make certain the beastkin weren't annihilated. That's not true. The objection came from a young man in a white tabard of a knight, a member of the Reichsknecht. Baron von Schlomberg had brought Captain Erich von Kranzbühler with him to the imperial palace as his adjutant. Always impressed with the captain's forthright manner and honourable character, he hadn't thought twice about bringing him to Prince Sigdan's castle. "The Reichsmarshal is a loyal man and a fearless soldier," Erich continued, unperturbed to have the attention of so many of the Empire's leaders focused upon him. "If the Emperor was using him, then it was from deceit." The young knight bristled at the incredulity he still saw on the faces of those around him. "Can anyone here say they haven't been forced to do the same?" Count von Suckelhoff smiled. "One of Bockenford's officers has been carrying on with the Shepster employed by my wife. It seems he was complaining about the Emperor giving him orders to finish the campaign before Mitterbst, when going and drawing off most of their cavalry to guard the Bretonnian frontier." The Westerlander shook his head. "I'd think such deceptions would be unnecessary if the Reichsmarshal was another of the Emperor's sycophants like Ratomir and that peasant Kreisig." "What does it matter, one way or another?" Kretsalescu declared. "The problem right now is in the army. It is the damn head tax or war tax or whatever the Emperor wants to call it. In Sylvania, we've had 3 poor harvests in a row, and enough ill omens to put a curse on Tal himself. I can name a dozen villages that have fallen prey to illness, and half a dozen more that have been abandoned by both lords and serfs. Things stand much the same in the rest of Stirland," Baron von Clausewitz commented, a haunted look creeping into his eyes. "Plague?" Prince Sigdan asked, giving voice to the dreaded word. It seemed to echo throughout the hall, sending shivers down the spine of every man at the table. "Shall you have mercy?" von Schlomberg whispered, invoking the goddess' protection against the fearsome spectre of pestilence and disease. Skaven blight. A cold, clammy smell wafted through the darkened halls. Furtive shapes scuttled and scurried against the ancient stone passageways, speaking and chittering as they crept through the shadows. The rats clawed their way through the piles of rags, swam through the scummy puddles of swamp slime, prowled across jumbles of old bones and tumble-down masonry. They leapt across the many holes pitting the crumbled floor, or swarmed across the stout cables spanning the worst of the gaps. The entrancing scent of food drew the ravenous vermin deeper into the primordial gloom. They ignored the rank odours of the creatures which called the maze-like confusion of the halls and galleries home. A starving scavenger learned to become bold around even the most rapacious predator. It was the boldest of the rats who scurried along the wall towards the alluring smell. The rat hesitated, a moment when its beady eyes spotted 2 flickers of green flame rising from darkness ahead. But hunger soon overrode caution, and the big grey rat hurried on towards the source of the smell. The lump of blackened cheese was lying within the glow cast by the nearest of the lights. Again the rat hesitated, but again its hunger drove it onwards. It hurried towards the beckoning cheese, leaping the last 3 feet to sink its fangs and claws into the enticing feast. As soon as the rat lighted upon the cheese, a great furry hand snapped out from the darkness, closing about the animal and its prize. The rat squealed in terror, writhing in its efforts to sink its fangs into the flesh of its captor. Its captor, however, gave the rodent no chance to retaliate. With practiced ease, a clawed thumb pressed down upon the rat's head, snapping its neck. Krisnik's sharp fangs stared down at the quivering carcass in his paw. Beady red eyes, hideously similar to the rat's own, gleamed with hunger. Long fangs, monstrously enlarged versions of those of the dead rodent's mouth, gnashed together in the expression of savage triumph. Whiskers twitched, ears shivered, a long naked tail lashed against the slimy wall, uttering a famished whine. The Skaven began to nibble at his catch. Save some cheese, snapped a voice from the darkness. Krisnik froze in mid-chew, turning a hostile glare at the speaker. Illuminated by the green glow of the further worm oil lamp was a black-furred rat man, his brutish frame encased in a hodgepodge of steel plates and strips of iron mail. A thick-bladed broadaxe was clenched in one of the creature's paws. "Catch take, more rat meat with cheese," the second Skaven hissed. Krisnik wolfed down the bite he had taken, then hurriedly closed his paws around the haft of his own broadaxe.
"My mine, cheese!"
he snarled.
"My mine, rat meat!"
The other Skaven bared his fangs in a murderous leer, his claws clenching tighter about the grip of his weapon. His greedy antagonist glared back at him. The two Ratmen, armed and armoured for battle, took each other's measure. The second Skaven reluctantly backed down, casting a worried glance at the massive steel-banded door behind him. Krisnik noticed the gesture, his former bravado evaporating in a shudder of fright. Almost sheepishly, he tossed the hindquarters of his catch to his comrade. It wasn't that he was worried about fighting the other guard. He was bigger and stronger than his comrade, and better with the axe. Besides, if he wasn't, there was that trick he learned about swatting an enemy's groin with the flat of his tail. No, it wasn't fear that made him relent. It was simply a matter of recognizing the dignity and decorum which was proper for a rat man of his position. A warrior entrusted with his protection of the shattered tower didn't lower himself to squabbling over morsels of cold, gamey rat meat, especially when the Lords of Decay would expect to find two guards exactly where they had been posted. It didn't appeal to Krisnik to consider what they would do should they find one of their guards missing. Clan Richters had enough ways of dealing with traitors and shirkers, all of them hideous and unspeakable. He didn't need to think about how much nastier the imaginations of the council members might be. Taking the tiniest nibble from his sliver of cheese, Krisnik darted a furtive look at the massive door. He was thankful the door was as thick as it was. Whatever the Council of 13 had been discussing for so long was nothing for his ears. The Lords of Decay took great pleasure displaying the bodies of spies when they were through mutilating them. Several score decorated the spires of the shattered tower at present, but the rulers of Skavendom were always able to find room for more. Krisnik shivered in his armour. Maybe joining the elite Vermin Guard hadn't been such a good idea after all. Which one of his jealous rivals had arranged to put him into such predicament? He wondered. Eerie green light cast strange shadows across the enormous hall, rendering its immensity a patchwork of darkness and illumination. The light streamed from a pair of gigantic crystal spheres, bound in cages of iron and supported upon great pillars of bronze. A confusion of wires and hoses drooped from the pillars, reeving along the stone floor until it vanished into a huge copper casket. A wiry Skaven, his fur dyed a deep crimson where it had not scarred, with burns, scrambled about the casket with frantic, jittery motions. His gloved paws flew across the levers, hastily adjusted valves, causing the green light to flicker, small bursts of glowing gas to billow from the vents in the bronze pillars. The Warlock engineer bit down on a curse as the mechanism resisted his efforts. The warp lantern was a new invention, the latest of techno-sorcery of Clan Skyer. A lamp that created light, not from rat dung or worm oil, but from the wart stone itself. A magnificent creation that would illuminate the whole of the Under Empire and bring much profit to the Warlock engineers, if they could only get the thing to work right. Glaring through his goggles, the technician growled at the scrawny Skaven slaves locked inside the generator, forgetting for the moment that his snarls were wasted. The slaves were blind, deaf, and mute, a precaution against their learning any of the council's secrets. Angrily, the Warlock turned back to the copper casket, stabbing his claw against one of the buttons. A spark of blue electricity crackled from the coil and set at the top of the generator cage, shocking the slaves and jolting them into motion. The slaves began scrambling inside the cylindrical cage, their momentum causing it to revolve. The energy of their terrified efforts raced along the wires, feeding the warp lanterns and causing the green lights to stabilize. Tugging nervously at his whiskers, the Warlock engineer glanced across the cavernous hall to the great table where the masters of Skavendom were all gathered. His glands clenched as his eyes roved across the concentrated gathering of evil and villainy. In the Under Empire, there were no Skaven more fierce or ruthless than these 12. As luminary of the shattered tower, it was his duty to provide light for those merciless monsters, that they might be better to see their surroundings, so to be as assured that none of their rivals had broken with custom and brought assassins into the sacred confines of the great chapel. The luminary darted an anxious glance at the supreme overlord of Clan Skyer, the cruel warp master Cyphar Doom. The wizened Cyphar was hunched in his steel-backed chair, his paws folded against each other, his fingers stroking the copper wires embedded in his scarred fur. Cyphar's face was a patchwork of skin grafts and iron plates, his eyes a pair of enchanted rubies, 3 sizes too big for their sockets, and held in place by a confusion of sutures and stitches. There was a compact power plant hidden somewhere beneath the warp master's flowing black robes, connected to the thick black cable implanted in the side of his jaw. When his withered lips pulled back to expose his metal fangs, blue sparks crackled about his teeth. It was a vivid reminder all around Cypher that he had survived several attempts to murder him, and a promise that the next attempt would be quite costly to his killers. The power plant was wired to his heart, and should that organ stop beating, the result would be quite explosive. Warpmaster Cypher Doom didn't seem to notice the flickering warp lights of the luminary's efforts to stabilize them. His attention was fixed upon other Skaven seated about the council table. His ruby eyes gleamed as each facet focused upon a different rat man. In the deadly maze of schemes and intrigues that formed the council politics, it was dangerous to ignore any of them. The weaker lords of Decay were forever scheming to rise higher in the hierarchy of the Under-Empire. The stronger were equally determined to ensure that they retained their positions. Cypher cast a covetous look at the 12th throne, a trickle of drool causing his metal fangs to throw sparks. There were 12 seats upon the council. Here, within the grey chapel, the seats were arrayed about an ancient oaken table, each throne radiating outwards from the great stone chair, which was the Black Throne, the 13th seat set aside for the great horned rat. The most powerful lords of Decay occupied the thrones to the left and right of their god. The 1st and 12th seats, that on the right was the seer seat, always occupied by the seer lord, master of the grey seers and grand prophet of the horned rat. It was the seer lord's function to implement the edicts of the council and to interpret the will of the absent horned rat, supposedly above the bickering and politics of the Skaven clans. The seer lord was as ambitious and greedy as any rat man, used his position to further his own power, exploiting the vacant black throne to give himself a double vote whenever the need arose. CL Skritar was going to need the double vote now. The fact pleased Warpmaster Cypher. The priest had dominated the council for far too long, and it was time that he was put in his place. The bells fixed to Skritar's long horns tinkled as the grey Skaven tried to suppress the tremors of rage rushing through his body. With his ruby eyes, Cypher's vision penetrated the oak table to see the Seer Lord's tail lashing angrily against the side of his throne. How it must vex the prophet to have all his careful allegiances and treaties crumbling before his eyes, and to have them swept aside by the Seer Lord's most hated enemy, the bloated arch plague lord of Clan Pestilence, Pontifex Nurglich IV, only made the spectacle even more delicious.
The man-things fight amongst themselves.
The whisper-thin voice of Blight Ten-Scratch rasped through the shadows. A creature as twisted as his noxious clan, Blight was the despised ruler of the bug-breeding clan Verms. Wormore was only a small part of their clan's fortunes, their real wealth coming from the extermination infestations of fleas and ticks, infestations most rat men believed Verms himself had caused.
Now it is time to fight slay,
Blight hissed, snapping one of his scabrous paws against the table.
Kill all man-things and take their land. The man-things won't fight each other if given a common enemy.
The sharp tongue of Shadowmaster Creep slashed across Blight's words. Leader of Clan Eshin, Creep commanded the most vicious cadre of killers and assassins in the Under-Empire, making this one of the most feared names in Skavendom. Cypher thought it was a shame Creep had allowed religious fervour and steady bribes to make him Skritar's laprat.
They will set aside their animosity to fight us,
Creep pronounced, raising one of his black talons.
We cannot fight all of the man-things. Then why did he send the Death Master Silky to kill the Vilna man? Just help, stupid beast mate.
The angry snarl came from Ratnak Vile, high vivisectionist of Clan Moulder. The burly Ratnak was twice the size of Creep, with immense paws tipped in steel talons within the Master Moulders had grafted to their clan lord's bones. Ratnak's eyes were glazed from the frequent overuse of warp dust, and his posture was always that of a cornered beast ready to pounce. Creep's paws vanished into the folds of his cloak, closing about whatever weapon he had hidden there, unless the assassin had coated his blades in a very powerful poison. Cypher didn't rate his chances against the monstrous Ratnak.
Man-things fight, man-things die.
The sepulchral moan of the warlord Necrot sent a shiver through the room. Though he occupied a lowly place upon the council, the ghoulish master of Clan Mordkin presented a terrifying aspect. His fur bleached to the colour of polished bone, his armour adorned with the skeleton of his predecessor. Clan Mordkin had reached a prominence during the war years against Nagash the Accursed, and they had been obsessed with death and decay ever since. Necrot's black eyes gleamed from the black skull mask he wore, his fangs bruxing as he contemplated the death and destruction of an empire. If it came to war, the other council members would think in terms of plunder and loot, but Necrot would care only for how much killing his clan would get to do.
Boris Man, now Emperor,
stated Rakshi Deathclaw, glowering from within his red hood, his face obscured by a strip of scarlet cloth. Murder Lord of Clan Scully. Rakshi was a bitter rival of Creep, envious of Clan Eshen's power and prestige. He could always be counted on to vote against Creep, and by extension, CL Werner, with many warrens underneath the sands of Araby, it was also in Scully's best interest to maintain favourable relations with the Pestilens and their extensive Southlands power base.
Yes, yes,
agreed General Bonestab, the steel-encased warlord of Clan Grick.
My spies tell me Boris Man hated much by man things with no leader. Man things not fight. Dwarf things more problems than man things,
snapped Warlord Mangler Baneburrow, commander of the teeming hordes of Clan Fester.
Dwarf things killed Dragon, now try to steal Fester Warren in Karak Agzal. We must crush, slay all dwarf things. We will kill, slay all dwarf meat.
The words came in a venomous hiss. The eyes of the council turned against the 12th throne, and the malignant creature seated there. Lord Vecteek, the murderous warmonger of Clan Rictus, preened his silky black fur as he leaned back in his stone chair, plundered from the dwarf halls of Karak Ungor. Clad in the suit of steel plates that sported an array of spikes that would have shamed a rose bush, Vecteek let his piercing grey eyes linger upon each of his rivals. Even those who habitually sided with Clan Rictus squirmed under the warmonger's scrutiny.
The dwarf meat will be slaughtered, Vecteek pronounced. But first, we will enslave the humans. We will use their field and their herds to make us strong, to feed new armies. Then we will annihilate the dwarf things. The man things are still too many,
insisted Creep.
We will lose too many fighting them. We will be too weak to conquer dwarf things. Who said we will fight them?
Vecteek chortled, his wicked laugh echoing through the grey chapel.
Arch-Plague Nerglitch has brought us a new weapon.
Vecteek extended his claw, gesturing for the pox defects to speak. Nerglitch reared up in his seat, his corpulent mass undulating in a loathsomely boneless fashion. The Arch-Plague Lord was cloaked in a decayed habit of leprous green cloth, split in many places where the diseased Ratman's buboes had swollen past the Raymond's ability to restrain. Great thorns sprouted from Nerglitch's spine and shoulders, dripping a foul green sludge from their tips. Clouds of black flies swarmed over his rotten mass, crawling about the tattered hood, which cast his face into the shadow. When he spoke, the Plague Lord's pestilent breath sent squadrons of flies dropping to the floor.
Glory to the magnificence of the Horned One,
Nerglitch coughed.
In his true aspect,
he added, shifting his hooded face towards CL Werner.
By his divine grace, we, his true servant, have discovered the most blessed of his contagions.
Nerglitch unclasped the heavy tome he wore, chained about his neck, pulling away mouldering pages until he exposed a hollow within the book. His warty paw emerged, clasping a glass vial. The other Lords of Decay cringed away from the Plague Lord, each waiting for one of the others to leap from his seat and start the rush for the many hidden exits within the Grey Chapel's walls.
The Horned Rat brings to us a new holy plague.
Nerglitch chortled, brandishing the vial aloft. His boast did nothing to ease the fears of the other lords. The slicing voice of Vecteek, however, reminded them that there were other things to fear.
Coward trash!
Vecteek snarled.
Sit! Stay! Here, listen! The plague is harmless to our kind. It will only kill man-things.
First among equals, Vecteek's words was law among his fellow Lords of Decay. It wasn't belief, but obedience that kept the councils in their seats. Only the connivance of the Vermin Guard could have allowed Nurglich to bring his poison into the shattered tower, and no Ratman in Clan Rictus was insane enough to dare such a thing without Vectig's permission. As they stared at the Varl, the council members saw not only the power of pestilence, but the dominance of Rictus. The reminder wasn't a pleasant one.
How do we know it will kill man-things?
Ratnak Varl asked. His lips curled away from his fangs.
How do we know it will not kill Skaven?
Vectig rose from his seat, clapping his paws together at the sound. A gang of Vermin Guard came slinking into the Grey Chapel, wheeling a great glass cage ahead of them. Inside the cage, a motley confusion of scrawny ratmen and dirty human slaves moaned and whined, clutching weakly at the transparent walls of their cell. The assembled Lords of Decay shifted uneasily as they noted the markings on the pelts of the Skaven locked inside the cage, finding a representative form from each of their clans among the captives. One piebald ratman even displayed tiny horns, making him resemble a grotesque grey seer. Another signal from Vectig and Nurglich oozed out from his chair and approached the cage. Plague Priest dragged open a tiny portal, then dropped a little vial into the cage. The vessel shattered as it struck the floor, expelling a black fog into the cage. For a moment, the captives were lost within the veil of darkness. Then the veil fell away as the fog dissipated, condensing into black soot. The Skaven slaves continued to paw madly at the glass walls, squealing in terror. The human captives, however, lay strewn about the floor, their flesh marked with weeping sores and suppurating buboes.
No sickness,
Nurglich coughed.
Plague is for man-things. Won't kill Ratkin, my apprentice, Poxmaster Puskab Falfa. Test new plague on many man-things. 9 of 10 die.
The statement brought greedy glitters to the eyes of the assembled ratmen. 9 of 10? The humans would be so decimated that even if they were united they opposed no threat at all to the hordes of the Under-Empire. The Ratman would be able to sweep the humans aside and claim the surface for their own. Fat from the plunder of the Man-Thing's empire, they would be stronger than ever in the history of Skavendom. Sci-Far's tail twitched as he studied Nurglich. The Plague Lord was a zealot, a religious fanatic, whose clan had once tried to enslave the entire Under-Empire. If the Plague Priest truly had a weapon of such potential, then the power of Clan Pestilence would grow beyond measure. He cast an envious glance at the 12th throne. Wresting the seat away from warmonger Vectig would be hard enough, but to usurp control of it from Clan Pestilence might be impossible. He turned his gaze across the table to CL Skritar. As much as it galled him, Sci-Fi would have to side with the Grey Seer when things came down to a vote.
I have seen the effectiveness of Puskab's disease,
Seer Lord Skritar declared, leaving unsaid whether such intelligence had come from a sorcerer's visions or flesh and blood spies. Nurglich growled as he heard the Grey Seer bestow credit for brewing the disease upon his apprentice, an insult made all the more vexing for the truth behind it.
This new plague has the potential to leave our enemies helpless, to decimate them in their thousands,
Skritar continued. Sci-Fi waited for the Grey Seer to twist these seeming strengths into reasons why the Council must oppose Nurglich's new weapon. Instead, the Grey Seer shocked the other Lords of Decay by endorsing the contagion.
The horned rat displays his beneficence in strange ways,
Skritar said, tilting his head towards the empty black throne, almost as though they were listening to some unseen speaker.
He was overlooked, the eccentricities of Clan Pestilence, and though them bestowed upon us the weapon that shall bring about the long prophesied ascendancy.
The Prophet Sorcerer turned towards Vectig, bowing his head.
We should ask the council to vote. I say we endorse this new weapon and use it immediately against the man-things.
Again, Skritar cocked his head towards the empty seat. If needed, there was no mistaking which way the Horned Rat would cast his vote. Vectig stared suspiciously at the Steer Lord. At that moment, Vectig seemed to be considering using his Vermin Guard and stopping whatever scheme Skritar was hatching before it could start. However, murdering the Sea Lord was one of the few things beyond Vectig's power. It would give many enemies of Clan Rictus the justification they needed to band together and overthrow the warmonger. Nothing was more guaranteed to incite the rabble of Skavendom like holy war.
This new plague will achieve more than 100 armies,
Vectig said.
The Boris man made the man things divided and suspicious. This will make them vulnerable to the plague. Before they know what is happening, it will be upon them, because they are divided and they will not stop its spread.
His black paws clenched into a fist.
They will be broken and beaten before our first warriors leave the tunnels.
With both Sealord Skritter and Warmonger Vecteek supporting the plan, the vote was purely ceremonial. In the end, only Warmaster Cyphar and Great Lord Vermin of Clan Moors opposed the plan. Cyphar couldn't stifle the feeling of alarm that coursed through his glands every time he caught a sniff of Nurglich's gloating protrusence. The new plague might benefit all of the Under Empire, but there was no question the plague priest would reap the dragon's share of the plunder. Of course, there was a possibility he was certain had occurred to every warlord in the council. If pestilence could make a plague to kill man-things, certainly they could create another one to turn against their fellow Skaven. Whatever they were up to, Cyphar was determined that Clan Skyer would be watching and waiting. Warlord Vermic's opposition was less complex. There was no creature above or below the surface he hated more than the Grey Lord Vecteek. Cyphar wondered if that would be enough to make him an ally against Clan Pestilence when the time came, because there was no question the new plague would do what Nurglich promised. The uncertainty lay in what would happen after. Nuln. The Black Rose sat perched along a hilly road in the riverside section of Freiburg. From its threshold, a patron could stare straight down the street to the clear waters of the Reich and see the grey rocky spires of Hellstromug, a little island rising at the joining of the river. The distant spires of abandoned Cathedral of Sigmar were visible in the morning light, deserted since the great fire that had claimed the old Grand Theogonist and much of Wissenland's Sigmarite priesthood. Beyond the ruined temple stretched its farmlands and pastures, desolate and unused, after months of bickering among the nobles over who had the greater claim to the lease of the now tenantless land. Walter sighed as he looked down the road. Nuln was a city in the grip of change. Emperor Boris had removed the capital to Altdorf following his ascension, removing the lustre from the place that had been called the Jewel of the Empire when Grand Theogonist Thorgrab was elected to the head of the Sigmarite faith. He had stopped reconstruction of Hellstrom Cathedral and relocated the seat of the Temple of Altdorf. In the space of only a few decades, Nuln had lost its position as the centre of both the Empire's secular and spiritual worlds. A feeling of malaise and bitterness gripped the hearts of Nulners, an impression that their greatness was past and all that was left to them was a slow slide into decay and ruin. The rat-catcher shook his head. There was nothing he could do about Nuln's lost glory. That was for Count Arthur and the Assembly to worry about. His own problems gave him trouble enough. They might not be the sort of thing to vex a baron or a duke, but to Walter they were more important than the great mysteries of Verena. Dawn found the Black Rose almost deserted. The bushy-bearded Bremer was tending the bar, cleaning out clay tankards and liven jacks. A few lamplighters and chimney sweeps were scattered about the tables. A real custom happened between sunset and midnight, when sailors and stevedores trooped up the hill from the docks. Companies of students descended from the Universitat. Then the place would be bustling confusion of songs and jests, hard-drinking river traders, and brawny lumpers, their clothes reeking of fish. Walter preferred it quiet. He was used to the silence, the stillness of the sewers, where the only sounds were the crackle of his rushlight and the furtive skitter of the rats. Noise, the racket of too many people crammed into a small place, was to him a frightful thing. Sometimes he was happy that people shunned the company of a rat-catcher. It made it so much easier, except in one area. Walter's pulse quickened as he looked out across the tavern and spotted the woman making her way from the kitchen with a platter of black bread and frumenty. His eyes fixated upon her shapely figure, upon the way her body pressed itself against the simple wool kirtle and linen apron she wore. Even in the tavern's gloom, her long golden tresses seemed to shimmer like pieces of the sun. He watched as she rounded one of the tables, setting the platter before the grey-faced militiamen seated there. Walter's gaze darkened when the soldier made a grab for the woman's waist.
"Just a little kiss, Zena,"
the militiaman suggested, starting to rise from his chair. The woman placed her hand on his shoulders, pushing him back.
"None of that, Meisel,"
she scolded him and twisted away from his clutch.
"Eat your porridge and be content with a full belly."
Meisel frowned at his meal.
"I'll miss your cooking, Zena," he said, "almost as much as those big blue eyes,"
he added with a wink. "Leaving us, Herr Meisel?" Bremer called out from behind the bar. Meisel shifted in his chair around so he could face the bar.
I've been charged, he said. Me and 100 like me, Emperor Boris has placed a new tax for every dieselman a lord retains. He dipped his spoon into the bowl of frumenty. The nobles are scrambling to cut their expenses. They'll cry a different song if the goblins come again, Bremer cursed. Or if the beastmen decide to come down from Drakwold, they'll be begging you fellas to take up arms again. The militiaman clenched his fist. They'll be begging before then, he swore. There's a knight named Engel who's organising a march on Altdorf. We're going to petition the Emperor himself and make our demands known. While Meisel and Bremner continued their exchange, Xena retreated back to the kitchen. Walter knew she detested talk of politics and religion, of anyone wasting their time arguing about things which they had no control. She might endure the groping fingers of a drunken dock walloper, but she couldn't abide a beer hall agitator. Walter intercepted Xena as she reached the kitchen door. "Xena?" he whispered, clenching her by the string of her apron. She spun around, her hand raised to strike an accoster. When she recognized the rat catcher, her expression softened from anger and annoyance. "Sheol," she sighed. "Of course no night is complete without being poured by a rat man." Walter winced at the reprimand, releasing the apron string as though it had suddenly been transformed into a hissing serpent. "I didn't mean—" "You never mean anything," Xena said. Her eyes dropped to the rat catcher's hands, becoming hard when she saw the blood on them. "You might have washed a bit before coming here." "I'm sorry, a few of them nipped me tonight," Walter explained, trying to wipe his hands clean on the rough wool of his breeches. "One of them is going to gnaw off your fingers," Xena warned him. "I told you before, you should find better work." Her eyes softened when she saw the ugly gash Walter's efforts had reopened. "Oh, one of those filthy things is going to bite off your fingers." The rat catcher made no protest when Xena unwound her scarf and ministered to the wounded hand. The sting of his torn flesh was nothing beside the warm rush that pounded through his heart. "No hunter is completely safe from his quarry," Walter said. "It's just one of the risks he accepts." He reached down, cupping Xena's chin in his hand, lifting her face until her eyes met his. "I'm doing it all for you. I'll make enough to support you, to raise a family." Xena pulled away, her expression becoming angry again. "A penny tale?" she scoffed. "You'll raise children on a penny a tale?" Walter smiled, reaching to his belt, removing the coins Osman had paid him. An exultant feeling filled him when he saw Xena's eyes light up at the sight of the silver. She snatched them from his hand and stared at them in wonder, almost as though she couldn't believe they were real. "That's just the beginning," Walter assured Xena. He was thinking of his steadily increasing numbers of rats that he'd been seeing in the sewers. He was also thinking of Osman's empty shells and the embargo against Sterling. Gently, the rat catcher closed Xena's fingers around the coins and kissed her hand. "Don't worry," he told her. "The happy times are coming."